All right, Molo Sanbonani. Hello, how's it? Good evening, good evening, good evening. It's a Friday evening. Now, you'll know, of course, that I'm actually not here live because it is my Shabbat or Sabbath, and do not touch tech or any social media during a Sabbath. I literally go back into a caveman-like existence. That's the life of a Jew. But nonetheless, welcome to it. My name is Usikle Ngobese, your favorite fat boy here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. That's right. Remember, of course, we've been doing the BDL show every evening this week, as this is the final week of content for 2022. I'll see you again next year, mid-January. And if, of course, you watched Vuganazo this morning, you'll know that it's not really a hiatus. I'm not really taking a rest per se. Lots of planning, lots of meetings will be happening as the show is going solo, and we're reintroducing the ambit or the side of the show where we're out and about. I'm in your community talking to you. So yeah, expect some really big things from the show next year as we even relaunch it in March with a whole new channel and radio features, even some TV. Woo! Y'all need to stay tuned to the Big Daddy Liberty channel. Good stuff is coming your way. Speaking about staying tuned, one of the best ways, of course, you can support the show is to hit that like button. Do it right now, whether you're watching this simulcast on Twitter, Facebook, or on YouTube. And of course, if you are watching on YouTube, do me an even bigger favor. Subscribe to the channel. Help me grow my subscriber base, and let's begin to burst through that glass ceiling I've kind of had of 40,000. It's been so elusive. Help me get to it, hit that subscribe button. And of course, remember, we now have a website. So go to bigdaddyliberty.com. There, of course, you can join what I've began to call the BDL Club, or a mug club of sorts that we're going to be starting. The South Africans who are supporting the show with between 50 to 100 Rand a month on a consistent basis. Those individuals are forming the first few people who are part of that BDL club, and you can support the show too. Go to the bigdaddyliberty.com and find a payment method that suits you. Guys, speaking about that, a merch store is coming, and those who are already subscribers, or rather, correction, who are contributing to the show, merch is coming your way. So we're sorting all of that out over this festive season. So keep an eye out for that. Now, that's a long introduction, a lot of jibber jabber. I do have my two guests, waiting for me in the lobby. First up, a familiar face, someone who I know you all love. Someone I have a lot in common with, insofar as not necessarily seeking the limelight. Oh, what's that? Secretly doesn't seek the limelight? I'm actually a weirdly reclusive person in real life. Don't be fooled by all of this. Anyway, I'm talking, of course, about Nic Lorimer. But Nick, Baba, good evening.
How's it, man? Good to see you.
Good to see you, brother. Of course, Nicholas Lorimer is with the Institute of Race Relations and a regular on the Daily Friend podcast. They, of course, have their own show called Two Crickets in a Thorntree. Nick, what's been going on? Are you guys still on air, or are you taking a bit of a hiatus?
Yeah, so we're off basically for December, and we'll be back, I think, second week of January. I think somewhere around there.
Alrighty, excellent term. My other guest this evening, of course, is another chap who you've seen on the show. He has changed hats since the last time we spoke to him here. He used to be with the Free Market Foundation. He's now one of the analysts over at the Center for Risk Analysis. I'm talking, of course, about Chris Hattingh. Chris, Baba, good evening.
Mr. Claire, Nick, good to see you guys. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Very glad to be with you guys.
Awesome, dude. Good to have you on the show. Guys, it's going to be a relatively quick show. We're cooking with grease in that regard, because I want us to have a look at the year that was, the year in review, in effect. And one can't begin the story without having the conversation around the state of the economy. I asked the question in the header of the show: do South Africans have any reason for some festive cheer this year? How has the economy treated them? And having that conversation, of course, you can only have it without, you can't have it rather, without looking at the unemployment figures in this country. It's a crazy and sad affair, Chris.
No, absolutely. I think we are unfortunately every year steadily seeing the ramping up negative effects of the wrong ideological and policy choices of the last 15 years. You now see it exacerbated by things like rolling blackouts, which have reached stage 6 at this point. Fortunately, Eskom has gotten rid of Andre de Ruyter, so load shedding should be resolved within the next week or two. We needn't worry about that. But South Africa has not set itself up well to weather global economic storms. We've not enabled ourselves to create jobs on a sustainable level, to attract investment. We've flirted with things like expropriation without compensation. Even just talking about those things means that serious capital investment doesn't want to come into your country. And as we head out of the last vestiges of COVID-19 and you see countries opening up again, we're now heading into what will probably be a global recession because, surprise, surprise, when you pump a lot of liquidity into markets in the form of welfare checks, you undermine the value of currencies. Money doesn't go as far as it used to, and economic activity contracts. So we've set ourselves up now for a more difficult time, as I think the global context is also going to be one of even more economic headwinds coming up soon. I think the US will enter a recession. If they haven't already, they will enter one next year. China seems to be leaving behind its zero COVID policy now, but they're going to suffer. They're one of our biggest export markets. Europe also, they're experiencing low growth. All of that means bad news for South African exporters. Where do we find our growth? Well, we're not going to find that if we're not attractive for investment in the first place. So we can either set ourselves up well or we can't. And I think, unfortunately, for the time being, we're going to continue pittering around with surface level reform, but not the real stuff that we need to get unemployment, get a good handle on unemployment.
Absolutely. And the unfortunate thing is here, Nicholas, is that often when we talk about the data, the numbers, when it comes to unemployment, when it comes to the lagging and really slow economic growth in this country, we tend to forget, or rather, we tend to focus on poor individuals, as we should. But there's something in the air. I don't know if you've sensed it, Nicholas, where even middle-class people and people who considered themselves maybe 2 years ago as doing okay financially, struggling. You know, it's that Christmas period at the moment, but I'm not seeing the buzz at a retail level that perhaps one ordinarily sees. And again, I'm being anecdotal here. Your sense of things?
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I've seen a couple of adverts, interestingly enough, which have acknowledged explicitly the fact that it's been a tough year. And they're kind of trying to connect with customers on those lines, saying, hey, it's been a tough year, but we'd still, like some of your money. But, inflation has, I think, been really painful for people. We've seen inflation this year take off in quite a big way. Unemployment is still, of course, shockingly high. By some measures, we remain one of the most unemployed countries in the world. And with the really bad year of load shedding, I think a lot of people who are already kind of in the economy are struggling to keep their foothold. And a lot of people who are out of the economy, those who are living off of grants, those who are struggling through unemployment, are just kind of giving up hope. I think it's been a really bad year in terms of sort of sitting in the doldrums. Now, apparently the economic growth has picked up a little bit in the third quarter, although with all the massive amounts of load shedding, I doubt that's going to remain the case into the fourth quarter. So it's just generally been a pretty poor year. Whatever the case is, growth is going to end up being quite anemic, and we're really in much the same place, if not slightly worse, than we were at the end of last year.
Well, let's stick to that last bit because you raised it, and rightly so. 2022 has been really characterized by some of the worst load shedding ever, and there is a laughable merry-go-round that we're seeing between the political establishment, the political elites, and of course those at the helm of state-owned enterprises, namely in this instance Eskom, where Andre de Ruyter has become this awkward, laughable, and entertaining scapegoat for the RET faction, who are dribbling and distracting the country, of course, from the fact that SOEs have been, for the longest, a cash cow for the political elites, and that cash cow behavior, enabled, of course, by legislation by politicians, such as BEE, is coming back to bite us in the worst way possible, where it's enabled this criminality at Eskom, for example, that is causing, to an extent, this exacerbated load shedding. If you're having people replace coal supplies in the procurement line with fine sediment and rocks because they want to sell the coal for a higher price elsewhere, Nicholas, there's three things here: SOEs, bad policy, and the collapse of the rule of law.
No, you got it exactly right there. And they all come together to make Eskom essentially unworkable. The fact that something like half of their generating capacity, or close to half of it, is often broken, which is why we've been sitting in so much load shedding all the time, which is crazy stuff. I was very skeptical of Andre de Ruyter when he came in. I thought that without seriously challenging the political leaders, he did probably about as well as he could have. And the fact that he's leaving is quite disappointing then, because you kind of really think to yourself, Eskom, considering these problems you've just talked about, but considering even if we got rid of the bad policy, it's still going to need major management reforms. It's still going to need significant improvements in, for example, cracking down on corruption and lawlessness and breaking of stuff. You're going to need someone really talented to do that. And after we've been through all these CEOs of Eskom, with Andre de Ruyter being just the latest, you really think, is anyone talented actually going to take up this position now? It kind of seems just like suicide with extra steps.
And maybe to that point, Chris, because I want to hash this out for just a minute before we move on, that conversation perhaps around why even rearrange the deck chairs of an Eskom, why even bother thinking a new CEO will be useful when scrap the damn thing, break it up, allow the private sector in. If anything, government can keep the grid, but really fundamental reform, Chris.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. You can have a new board, you can have all the new CEOs in the world, you can throw another 400 billion at Eskom. I don't think it's going to resolve basic issues of things like supply and demand, things like endemic corrupt networks, all that sort of stuff. You can have all the money and it's not going to solve any of those problems. So I think you're right. You can have, if we want to assume the other side of the ideological argument, you can assume, fine, have some sort of state company to help supply citizens who really can't afford to buy electricity from private providers, but for the rest, open it up at the very least. Then you'll see some kind of addressing of the structural problems. The debt might come down as well, all that sort of stuff. But of course, that means letting go of some control, and the National Democratic Revolution doesn't allow for the ANC to let go of those levers of power. They're being forced into some concessions and some superficial reforms. So now, for example, lifting the cap on self-generation, which we saw this year, and praise now that President Ramaphosa has a stronger grip on the NEC so he can implement faster, quote-unquote, reforms. But you still need a license from NERSA to self-generate. You still need to go through that bureaucratic process. So yes, the cap has been lifted, but you still need to go through a lot with the state is involved. So is it really lifted or not? These technical points where I think the ANC is still very much wanting to keep a hold of levers of power for as long as possible.
Absolutely. And it compels me to move us on to the next topic, because on the one hand, we've just spoken about the absolute destruction caused by politicians and the political elites due to bad policy, due to bad governance, and of course, due to the sort of opening up the door to the inevitable corruption that comes from a statist and really wannabe socialist approach to governing things. In other words, where a small elite decide everything, they control everything, they decide everything, and of course they decide things on behalf of their friends. The destruction that is caused to the economy, unmatched by the destruction that Mother Nature caused. One has to go back to KZN. These images became a regular sight for those of us who live in this part of the world, to which, of course, we all knew, as you see these residents looking at the road being washed away here, we all knew as Durban and KZN residents that given all of the things we just mentioned, the corruption, the ineptitude, effectively the incompetence of our politicians, any hopes of rebuilding this is near zero at this stage. Nic, I'm going to come to you. We're still sitting in a situation where very little has been rebuilt of a serious structural level. Isn't that just symptomatic of the country?
No, that definitely is correct. KZN's really had a bad run of it over the last 2 years. The riots, floods, and the ongoing sort of political stuff. And I think then that's going to be no surprise that the ANC will probably lose in the next election, the province, precisely because, voters may put up with quite a lot in South Africa, but there does come a point when they go, we'll try something else, regardless of what that is.
And trust to me, Chris, I want to bring you in here. I'm going to spend 3 minutes on this one, because there's almost, I don't know how to put it, a perfect storm. I think that's a good expression. A perfect storm where there's multiple systems coming together to create this massive supercell that we're going to see explode in 2024. And there's multiple factors involved. Well, Nic is right in pointing out that the state of things in the province has become a push factor for people to say, maybe we need some change electorally, and maybe the marching three elephants, that's of course the symbol of the IFP, is the direction we're going to move in, as the IFP literally tramples on the ANC in this part of the world. But also there's another push factor, a resurgence of a Zulu nationalism, if you will, brought about by this incident to an extent, which we've covered on the show. That's, of course, on the left, King Mrs. Zulu, and on the right, Prince Smagatu, who were both initially vying for the throne, but the rightful king, of course, being King Mrs. Zulu. There he is, beaming there, looking rather dapper. But effectively, this new sentiment is rising in the province, and it's sort of wafting into all institutions of society here, of Zulus maybe saying there could be a possibility here of a tiered approach. Initially, you bring in the IFP, or you bring back the IFP in 2024, and slowly but surely build Zulu institutions that test the waters for an independent KZN, taking lead, of course, from that rising voice from the Cape that we've seen. Now, of course, even as I say this, there are people rolling their eyes because they don't want to engage this topic. But the truth of the matter is, it's a very popular sentiment at the moment.
Yeah, if there's anything that's been the best argument or the best proof in the pudding, as it were, for independence movements and a desire for a bit more community-based solutions, it is the ANC themselves, the ANC's ideological choices, and driving people to the sort of place where maybe that was always underlying, but now they realize to solve problems, to create jobs for themselves and their families, to just have safety. Those, I know, very radical, basic things that most South Africans across the board just want in their lives, that they're now looking for different solutions. And I think you're right to point that out. That is a trend that we could see rising. Maybe there's too much of a focus still on playing on government's turf and not on the other institutions in society. That, again, that idea of like churches and mosques and temples, that sort of thing, community organizations, where do those factor in, and how are those going to drive change in the country going forward? I think if you just look at the example of the flooding that happened in KZN, it's easy to blame something like climate change. It's the nice narrative. It's like, okay, this is popular. Explains it away. That doesn't mean that you couldn't have done some of the basic infrastructure work beforehand. So do you rely on national government to do that, or how do you equip yourself now going forward to solve that? We could see riots again in the future, given the high levels of unemployment and frustration. How do communities prepare for that? Do they wait for Pretoria, or do they deal with that themselves? Are you really going to wait for intelligence services with someone like Beki Tlele involved, or are you going to try and solve problems from a ground-up sort of approach? So all these things are becoming much more real, unfortunately. But I think it's also a good thing in a way. If you want a more resilient community, a more resilient cultural identity going forward, it probably is best to go through these sorts of processes instead of relying on the state to do everything for you and protect your culture and pay for everything and that sort of thing. I think now we'll see a bit of a relocation away from the centers of power, just by the simple fact that these policies haven't produced what they said they would.
And again, Nic, maybe it's a final point on this before I move us on, because Chris actually touched on where we're going, speaking about a one biggie, the asshat, but we'll get to him in a moment. Nic, I raised this topic because really, I think there is a broad conversation happening, and I called it the perfect storm, where even in other parts of the country, there is a move, a slow, gradual move away from the authority of Pretoria, both at a state level and secondly, by way of the party currently that holds onto the power, that controls the levers of the state, the ANC, namely. The ANC taking a drubbing in by-elections across the country. I mean, Diklabong, I think I'm pronouncing that properly, is a sound example. This community in the Northwest that basically said, okay, albeit they gravitate to the EFF, it's a move away. Much like here in KZN, a move away. Western Cape, same thing in other parts of the country. Are we seeing the ANC in decline here?
100%. And this is, when people start talking about stuff like independence, it's the inevitable result of state failure. It's people looking for, saying we need a radical solution. And I think independence is still probably pretty unlikely for these places. But what I think will end up being the compromise here is strengthened federalism. Think about 2024, a very likely election result, even if the ANC does quite well, is going to be they're going to lose Hattingh, they're going to remain very distantly in opposition in the Western Cape, and they're probably going to lose KZN. So that means South Africa's 3 most important provinces will all be controlled by the opposition. And you can bet your bottom dollar that all of them are going to suddenly, those 3 provinces are going to say, wait, why are you telling us what to do? We want to do what we want to do. We know what's best. We don't want to be governed by you guys. We have a different way of implementing things. And there's going to be a very big push for strengthening federalism in our country, which I think would be an extremely good development, because South Africa is a complicated and diverse place. And while I think that it's good for it to hang together as a country, it's probably going to be very advantageous if our provinces and our localities have a lot more power to govern themselves, to collect taxes for themselves, to set their own policy, so that we can have a bit more sort of policy and political diversity in the country, rather than the ANC's centralizing one-size-fits-all approach that has really strained the country's growth and development, I think, over the last couple of decades.
And even as you guys say this, and Chris, I mentioned that you are the catalyst of where we're taking this conversation, because 2022, unfortunately, another bloody year for South Africans. The crime in this country becoming something really of a spectacle. I don't know what else to describe it as. Murder, some of the most serious categories of crime in this country becoming a massive, massive issue. We're bumped up to now 76 murders a day. I just want to play these graphics because, you know, the images I'm putting on screen, unfortunately, have become commonplace in this country. You leave your home and you may very well stumble on a crime scene of one or the other, whether it's a actual crime scene like this one or a violent service delivery, in inverted commas, service delivery protests, which are becoming ever more frequent and more violent, or the spectacle in this country of a South African police service that doesn't respond to serious violence and criminality, as was the case in this image in the Eastern Cape, where these farms were under siege for over a week. Farmers fending for themselves, as you can see their property being destroyed. Again, this is the notion that I'm trying to get at here. We're facing a state with this hapless idiot, the asshat, as we call him on the show, unable to defend life, liberty, and our property rights. How do you run a functional society, Chris, when that is a state failing at its, in my view, one and only responsibility?
No, absolutely. And you've seen some commenters in more mainstream avenues this past year asking the question, is South Africa a failed state? Well, if you look at something like security, policing, maybe it's already past that point where you shouldn't ask the question, you should accept the reality thereof. In a lot of our research, the trends indicate that as people become more desperate, this doesn't justify it, but as there's more frustration in terms of progress, in terms of just having a job, putting food on the table, you need to take action and pursue other means of trying to affect change, maybe. And one of those ways is violent protest, maybe crime, that sort of thing. So as people become more frustrated, you shouldn't be surprised when this kind of thing happens. Again, some of the advice we try to give, if you're in a province like KZN, for example, the Eastern Cape, with perennially higher unemployment than the rest of the country, you need to prepare your business operations accordingly. How do you deal with that if those people in those communities become more frustrated and take to the streets in this way? So I think there's a strong argument to be made here for more localized solutions in terms of figuring out what are the challenges for different communities and how do they address those, because it doesn't help sort of clutching at your pearls on Twitter and denouncing it and that sort of thing. You can condemn these things in moral terms, but how do you implement solutions and policies? And you can't wait for that from Pretoria, I don't think, necessarily. How do you engage with local politicians? Maybe it's better to engage with your local ANC versus a national ANC, a local DA, a local EFF, any of these sorts of things. Maybe you just need to make those pragmatic choices and try and figure these things out. Maybe there's a party that I'm not even thinking of that's better for a certain community than others. So, for as long as someone like Lele and others in the intelligence services are involved, I don't think you're going to see top-down solutions coming, a real professionalization and solutions in terms of the police service. The incentives just aren't there. At the moment, the incentives are for, we're in this position, we need to protect ourselves for as long as possible, we need to rock the boat as little as possible, let's just continue along as we are, we've got VIP protection, South Africans must solve their own problems.
And perhaps there's that distinction who Chris raises, and almost us and them, where the us and them isn't between ordinary South Africans, it isn't between our race groupings as the the politicians and really the mainstream media would have us believe. Nic, the real us and them in this country is between the elites and political elites and the ordinary South African. I like to call them on this show the faith, flag, family, and freedom type South African. I don't have an army of bodyguards when I leave this house. No one drives me around. I don't live that faux reality or fake reality, as is the likes of Robo Begicele and the like. And because of that, when I then say things like on the show, no, dear South African, take charge of your own safety, take charge of your own security, become a competent, well-trained, and constantly training gun owner, because you never know when the day will come where you'll need that firearm to defend yourself. And it's more than just the firearm. Band together within like-minded neighborhoods, defend yourselves, defend your families. People lose their minds. But Nicholas, it's reality.
No, it is. I think 2021 was really when SAPS almost kind of gave up the ghost and we saw the July riots. And now it feels like the sort of entire security apparatus is being held together by sort of chewing gum and duct tape. There's a couple of good people in the police who are doing their best, private security companies and community groups. And that's really the only reason that we don't live in total anarchy. I think what you're saying there is already what's happening. People are having to take the lead themselves. And there's definitely a good side to that. But when you've got this police service that's entrusted with all of these powers, citizens are still quite limited by the law in the ways that they can actually look after their own security. And we do need a police service that functions. It's the reason you have a state. You might as well just get rid of the state if you don't have a police service that works. And I think we're really, you can trace a line back from so many of our problems in other spheres to the fact that SAPS just doesn't work at the moment. And until SAPS is fixed, we're going to sit with some very severe constraints on our quality of life for all South Africans. As you say, crime is weirdly a thing that kind of unites us because it's such a shared traumatic experience.
That's right.
We're gonna sit with the problems on our quality of life, on our economic growth, on just our general, I think, mental well-being, frankly, until the SAPS is in working order.
And let's get one thing straight, fellas. Yeah, and I want us to chew on this for just a minute because we're really running out of time. And I'm just going to ask for an extra 5 minutes just for us to wrap up all the topics because we're on the final topic. Speaking about the final topic, welcome to it. This is the Big Daddy Liberty Show. We're cooking with grease on the show. I'm in conversation, of course, with Nic Lorimer, one half of the Two Crickets in a Thorntree podcast. You'll find him on the Daily Friend. And, of course, analyst at the, I know you said Frederick Naumann, analyst at the Center for Risk Analysis, Chris Hattingh. Welcome to it. Hit that like button and subscribe to the show. Guys, as we wrap up this section, I want us to understand something here. As libertarians, we speak a lot about the notion of nearly anything and everything in society being dictated to by demand and supply. And something like safety and security, the feeling of wanting to be safe, there is a big demand for that. And it cuts across the income levels in this country. Often, historically, you always hear people say, oh, no, they'll say, it's just the rich who hire private security because they're fancy schmancy. They hate the fact that, they have to live amongst the criminals, as if poor people want to live amongst criminals, as if living in an informal settlement by de facto means, oh yeah, I totally accept criminality. We're beginning to see now poorer South Africans. I'm living in Umlazi at the moment. I'm between Umlazi and my farm. We're seeing residents of Umlazi basically forming their own private security. I made mention of this a while ago, that if you're someone who works in a place where maybe you come home late, like fast food joint or a casino, where you come home really late, you're now safer because there are guys who don reflective bibs, who carry spears, some carry guns and the like, and they man bus stops and taxi stops where people hop off in the evenings and they'll even escort you home, weaving through informal settlements and the like. That's private security by poor people who band together. Chris, the soft bigotry of low expectations, when really a lot of the private solutions, poor people can do too, and we should encourage.
Yeah, and that view of maybe thinking that the solutions need to come after workshops and politicians have had their summits and all that sort of thing, when the solutions might already are being done on the ground. People, have this. I know we like to. It's easy to disparage some lefty talking points, but people's lived experience, you have to account for that. They have to deal with these challenges. That's their reality. And they're trying to find solutions for that. It might not fit the narrative that you desire. It might not fit your squeaky clean way of classifying them as rich and middle class and poor, and according to arbitrary sort of race classifications, that sort of thing. But people are trying to solve this as best as they can. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty. But geez, give them some credit for trying to solve problems, because it's a heck of a lot more courageous than most politicians, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nic, I'm going to come to you because we have to move on to our final topic and wrap up the show. Here's an image for us. The ANC top 7. All right. They just recently had their elective conference. And of course, there is the basket of, in inverted commas, winners there, those who took the spoils, of course. And Nic, let's begin here. There is a conversation to be had, and this is the nub of what I want us to talk about, because 2022 is defined by it, and it's going to be defined going forward into the future towards 2024, the election. Is there a reform agenda with this ANC that is characterized by these individuals that we see on the screen? And even as I put them on the screen, let me quickly just flash this here. There's the NEC list. Obviously, people can't see this, but I'll just give it 3 seconds for you to pause the video for those who are watching this as a recording to go through the names. There's the second half of that list. And I'll come to Nic as I say this. Let's begin with the top 7 and let's look at the NEC listing before that. Does that top 7 speak to a reform agenda? And speak to me, yes, sorry, let me begin there. Does that top 7 speak to a reform agenda? Can we believe what the mainstream media and the intelligentsia tell us of? Cyril's hand has been strengthened, and now we need to go back and rally behind him in order to have this nirvana that Cyril delivers.
It's like a bad rerun of 2017. No,
literally.
It's not clear what Cyril's reform agenda is. So even if his hand is strengthened, that just might mean that he's going to accelerate towards EWC even faster. But there's 2 names that stick out for me on that. One is Nomvula Mokonyane. Put in the Zondo, all over the Zondo Commission, just so much evidence against her that she is just a bad hombre who is poisoning the well of South African politics, who has done really bad damage to this country, right? So there's a really great indication that that's a terrible sign. The second is any organization that elevates to, I guess you'd call it its 3rd highest position, Secretary General of the ANC, Fikile Mbalula, is an organization that is in serious trouble. I think Fikile Mbalula is not the brightest bulb in the shade. And the fact that he is now in the top 7 in the ANC, I think just shows the lack of talent, the lack of ability, the lack of just clear common sense in the ANC now. They can't even sort of put on a good show of pretending to be decent and well-meaning and forward-looking. This is not the ANC of Thabo Mbeki's era, where you had people who had sort of actual profiles who could hold a public debate. This is really scraping the bottom of the barrel. And let me talk about the NEC as well.
Just in a moment, I just want Chris to chew on this just for the brief 30 seconds. Then we move to the NEC, because I can tell you now, Chris, I keep citing it this week. Gareth van Onsling said something very, very, very apt, which is it's almost like that inverse graph, if you will, where there's a precipitous decline by the ANC in terms of its electoral performance, its standing in society and the like, there is a meteoric rise of the absolute worst of the ANC. That top 7 really simplifies that. Is that a word? Simplifies? Exemplifies the word I'm looking for. That.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, the cream rises to the top, or in this case, take your analogy that you like. Just
the turd rises to the top by the sounds of things. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, for me, the most interesting thing about the top 7 is Paul Mashatile. We predicted that he would probably be the deputy president. He would be elected as deputy president. That was confirmed. But also just how much power he's built up for himself and how closely he holds his cards to his chest. Don't be surprised if this Pala thing continues to some extent. If Ramaphosa really feels he should leave the stage at this point, don't be surprised if Mashatile becomes president next year.
That's right. And maybe, Nic, as we conclude, let's talk about this NEC. I mean, some of the names on here, dude, it's insane.
Yeah, no, Just as a brief aside, my grandfather actually hid Navula Mokonyane from the apartheid security police. So there's a sort of awkward connection between our family. But anyway, so when you look at the NEC list, it's really, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of the ANC intimately, as a lot of the mainstream media knows that much better than I do. But I can tell you that at least from the top 25, you've got some really dodgy characters. 3 names that kind of stuck out to me: David Mhlombo, who is been at least credibly connected. We don't know whether he actually is criminally with rhino horn smugglers. Mduduzi Manana, who was a former deputy minister, who pled guilty to assaulting 3 women in a nightclub in 2017 for calling him gay. I think he came like 2nd or 3rd on the NEC list there, which is just outrageous that you're putting someone guilty of assault up on the up at the heights of your party. But the worst, by far the worst in the NEC, this person came in 11th highest number of votes for the NEC, is Andile Lungisa. Andile, during an attempt by the ANC to subvert the democratic process of a council sitting, of a legal council sitting in the Nelson Mandela Bay, smashed a heavy glass jug over a DA councillor's head, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for assault. He was released after 2 months, outrageously, I think, on I think it was parole or something, or for good behavior or something. I don't know how that works. But any party that elevates him is firstly just the standards are, you could not put them lower. I guess maybe if someone had murdered someone, you could put them in the top there, but anyway. And it shows, I think, that the ANC doesn't give a fig about protecting democracy or democratic institutions. This really is a kind of mask-off moment that reveals at the core, they really still don't really jibe with this democratic thing, don't jibe with the legitimacy of the opposition. Because Lungisa is the epitome of that attitude in the ANC, that disregard for democratic norms, that disregard for a healthy society, that disregard for the legitimacy of the opposition. And
absolutely,
that worries me.
Guys, we've completely run out of time. I must cap it off here. And, even as I say this, I'm going to give you each final word, just a minute each, guys, really. Chris, I'll begin with you. And what I want you to opine here for us, or share here, is your vision of where we're going. What does the next year look like for you? And what do you want it to look like?
I guess I want it to look like a bit of a Thatcherite, Reaganite revolution in terms of policy reform, but I don't think that will actually happen. For South Africans, I think they should prepare for even tougher times next year. I foresee globally inflation will remain high and the South African Reserve Bank will follow accordingly. That means for South African consumers, tighter conditions, maybe try and deal with your credit borrowing costs as best as you can. Don't take on any of that big spending if possible for the next year. Maybe towards the end of next year, we'll see a bit of a reversal in terms of inflation and interest rates coming down. In the interim, don't expect big solutions coming from government. I think we're going to see an acceleration of South Africans trying to solve problems by themselves as we head towards 2024. And I think continue to look for internal strife within the ANC and how it spills out into society, and make sure that you're prepared for that accordingly as the party becomes more desperate before the general election in 2024.
Absolutely. Nic?
We're at a change moment in the country's history, kind of as Chris was saying there. And when you get a change moment, you get a lot of disruption. And a lot of that will make life quite difficult for a lot of South Africans, whether you're wealthy, whether you're poor, whether you're black, whether you're white, doesn't matter. We're all going to struggle next year. It's going to be a tough year. But if we make the right decisions as South Africans, if we make the right choices, if we elect the politicians who have the right ideas, if we campaign for the right things, in 2024, we will see the country move in a better direction. If we don't, the country will move in a worse direction, because at this moment of change, the status quo won't exist, and we're either going to get much better or much worse. And it's up to us to make sure that the needle goes in the right direction there.
I'll just get my sound back on. Absolutely. That, of course, is Nic Lorimer, who you'll find at the Daily Friend, co-host of Two Crickets in a Thorntree, also with the Institute of Race Relations, and, of course, Chris Hattingh, from the Center for Risk Analysis. A big thank you to both of my guests. And a big thank you to you, dear viewer, for having joined us on this, the last episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Last piece of content for 2022, a year in review. Are you having a festive Christmas? We spoke about the state of the economy, and I think that question is an apt one. Are you having a festive Christmas right now? Let me know in the comment section. How's this year treated you guys? You guys know me. I get very emotional when it comes to my love for you, the ordinary South African, the faith, flag, family, and freedom type South African. So maybe share it with me in the comment section, whether you're watching this live or later on as a recording, pardon me. The good, the bad, and the ugly for you of 2022. Let's share some stories in that regard. With that being said, a reminder, of course, if you enjoyed this content, hit that like button, please. Help me grow this channel. And speaking about growing the channel, subscribe to the show on YouTube. It's a very good way of basically broadening my audience. Tongue twister there. Broadening my audience is what I mean to say. And lastly, of course, we have a website, guys. And I really encourage you, support the channel. The stuff that we're about to do next year is really mind-blowing. I'm not just blowing it up for the sake of making you excited. I am genuinely excited about what we're doing, but it needs your support. Join this growing league of fans of the show who are contributing between 50 and 100 Rand per month to the show. If you go to the website at bigdaddyliberty.com, you can find a payment method that suits you, whether it's Patreon, PayPal, or even an EFT. Please do that, support the show. You'll be funding what we're up to next year. And boy, oh boy. Anyway, let me not say too much. With that being said, thank you for being a part of my 2022, and I hope to see you next year as we grow the liberty movement in this country. We grow a society defined by freedom, liberty, property rights, secure property rights, non-racialism, and indeed prosperity for all. So with that being said, from me to you, happy Hanukkah for those who are celebrating Hanukkah, and of course, Merry Christmas to our Christian community, and Happy New Year. That being said, even as you celebrate all of that, a reminder to you to never trust a commie.